Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is St. Louis on the Air.
I'm Elaine Cha. Since August 2021, the city of St. Louis has spent $4.8 million of its American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, funds on support for people without homes. Most of that money has gone to emergency sheltering. 2 winters later, and on a day cold and icy enough to have prompted many schools and some businesses to close, there's one new 24-hour shelter run by St. Patrick's Center, now open in St. Louis. Volunteers and providers say the addition of one shelter, opening halfway through winter, is unacceptable. The city says it's not at fault for the delay. Kavahn Mansouri is investigative reporter for KCUR in Kansas City and the Midwest Newsroom, which is a collaborative partnership between NPR and 4 NPR affiliates in Kansas City, Iowa, Nebraska, and here in St. Louis. He wrote about the situation last week, and he's here today to talk with us about what's happened since. Kavahn, welcome to the program.
Good afternoon, Elaine.
Now, your story, published last week, focused on how much federal money has been set aside for emergency sheltering and how it's been spent or not spent. And this money for homeless sheltering in St. Louis was allocated in 2021, and in August, in fact. Can you go over the numbers for how much money we're talking about?
Yeah, so in 2021, the city put around $16 million aside to basically go towards services that would help people who are struggling with housing. So far, the city's spent about $4.8 million of that dollars, and of that money, the unspent money, there's about $1.3 million set aside for the Safe Haven project. The Safe Haven project basically offers a low barrier entry, 24-hour safe haven that would serve the most at risk of the homeless population in St. Louis. And $1.3 million has been set aside for this project specifically.
Mm-hmm. Now, is there some factor, in addition to need for shelter over the winter, I mean, we're obviously feeling that now, that makes the story about the ARPA money more urgent?
Yeah, so we originally reported on this story several months ago in the summer, and when we initially reported on it, there was already questions being asked from the previous winter about why this shelter, and why other more of this money hasn't been spent more urgently, especially as winter had just passed and winter was going to be approaching soon. And when we talked to the city, they said, well, that will come, and they will have something up by the winter. But obviously, we're halfway through the winter now, and the Safe Haven has just opened. And a lot of providers and volunteers think that's unacceptable because obviously when people are out on the streets without housing and without shelters and even the volunteer and provider shelters fill up pretty quickly, and they have to turn people away very often. People end up getting severe cases of frostbite, hypothermia, and you may recall St. Louis Public Radio did an investigation, I believe in 2021, where they found several unhoused individuals ended up dying of hypothermia, per the St. Louis coroner. So that's why it's important to these volunteers, these providers, and certainly to the people who are struggling with housing.
And is there anything that you have heard from the city and city officials in whether it was formally or in passing that might provide some insight into why it is taking so long?
Yeah, absolutely. So the city has told me very clearly that, the request for proposal process that they must go through with ARPA funds is complex. And beyond that, finding a provider like St. Patrick's Center or City Hope, which they had previously had a deal that fell through, it can be very difficult. And once they find a provider that can fill those needs, finding a location can be difficult as well. Somewhere that can house, many people for 24 hours. Some that have issues, mental health issues, problems with substance abuse, things like that. This is a difficult process, and the city officials made that very clear that this is no easy task.
Mm-hmm. Now, since your story was published, and that was last Tuesday, what has changed, Kavahn?
Yeah, so St. Patrick Center opened their new safe haven called Grace House. I'm sorry. It is a 24-hour safe haven shelter, and from what I understand, they've opened and are finalizing details on a contract with the city that would fund it with this with these funds from the American Rescue Plan. They are confident they'll receive that money, and the city has told me that they still expect to go through with that contract. Mm-hmm. This shelter is, as I said, 24 hours. It offers, it can house, I think, roughly around 25 to 40 people, given the sort of the capacity and who's there. They get 3 meals a day. The safe haven also is very focused on finding these folks permanent housing. That's a huge focus of St. Patrick Center's work, and the safe haven specifically, to find these individuals some permanent housing.
So would that then necessarily involve a lot more, screening, if the goal is to get the folks who are in Grace House into a more stable situation?
I couldn't say for sure. I don't know the inner workings. I know that with Grace House, it is low barrier. We're talking about people who may not be allowed to go to the other shelters or have had problems in the past. Mm-hmm. And there's a full staff working there to support those folks so they can get the best help they can. But I couldn't say about the screening process. That'd be a good question for the St. Patrick Center.
Definitely something to follow up about. Now, St. Patrick Center, you did mention that the contract has not yet been finalized with the city. So how is it possible that they've been able to open this place without like an ink dry contract?
Well, yeah, I mean, St. Patrick Center operates, it's a nonprofit. They operate with city contracts sometimes, but also I believe that they take donations, and I believe I read in the Riverfront Times that they are saying this costs about $100,000 a month to operate. So I imagine they're paying for that, or they will be reimbursed in some way if and when the city finalizes the contract with them. But from what I understand, that's still being the final details are still being ironed out.
Okay. And St. Patrick Center has posted announcements on social media about this new 24/7 shelter being open, but as far as I could tell, there hasn't been disclosure about where exactly it's located. Do you have any sense as to why there's such reticence about location or prospective locations when it comes to other shelters?
Anything that I would say about that would be speculation. Mm-hmm. So I don't think I should go into that, just because I don't have a clear answer, and I haven't spoken to anyone about that specifically.
Okay, sure. Now, how much do you think we can expect to change in this winter season, like over the next couple of months?
That depends. The city has still a lot of ARPA funds on hand that they're planning on spending. A lot of those have been allocated already, but there's still some to spend. However, DHS has told me that those funds are programmed. They are being put towards something. Now, if those will go to, in the past, a lot of that money has gone to emergency shelters. I think actually the vast majority of the $4.8 million that has been spent has gone to emergency shelters. So that means DHS might, or the city, I should say, might give funding to a provider that's already providing these shelters during the cold weather. So that might already be happening, and volunteers and providers, especially during these cold snaps, this is when they open up emergency shelters. But a big complaint from the providers and volunteers that it's not enough. They can only do so much, and they really could use the city's support to house some of these people who are struggling with housing during these incredibly cold months, when they, because it gets to a certain point where they have to turn people away because there's just simply not enough beds, according to many of the folks that I've talked to.
Sure.
So I don't know how much more we'll see. I don't expect that there will be a big addition to the beds, but that remains to be seen.
Now, something that comes to mind, Dr. Yusuf Scoggin, who's the Director of Human Services, was on our show with community volunteers this month, and he had said then that people without homes from surrounding counties come into the city, and often from quite far away, and that the response to and provision for our homeless neighbors must be a shared responsibility. As you were doing your reporting, Kavahn, did you get any sense that part of what's delaying movement on establishing shelters here in the city, that it could be that there's some conversation happening about addressing these issues in a way that involves groups and entities sort of beyond the city limits?
When I talked with Yusuf at DHS, he told me the same thing, that yes, that does bring an additional stressor onto the city's providing. But however, when I talked to a few supporters, providers and volunteers, I guess there was kind of a reaction of like, well, who do people belong to anywhere? Do people belong to St. Louis City? If they're struggling with housing, do they belong to St. Charles? Do they belong to, the Metro East? That was the bigger question. But as for the actual kind of nuts and bolts of whether that is putting a stressor on, I couldn't say for sure. But if that's a question to be asked and to be further delved into.
And does it seem like there is sort of openness to talking with you, frankly, about some of the obstacles that exist on the side of the city, and not just Dr. Scoggin, but others who are working around addressing this issue?
The city has been somewhat open about the spending of the ARPA funds and with unhoused, but I will say that there is a not from my end, but from the providers and volunteers I've talked to, there's been some talk that relationships between the city and the people who are trying to serve people who are struggling with housing has never been worse. There's just a lot of tension from the providers I've talked to, who I've seen at outreach meetings, things like that. People seem to be frustrated, especially as this is the second winter where these ARPA funds are available, and from their perspective, more needs to be done. I think one volunteer I talked to said, I think, quote, it was ghastly behavior to not do more.
Kavahn, what questions do you still have about this story, or would you like to have answered?
I guess I would like to see. I have interest in who will be getting these a lot of the other funds from the American Rescue Plan Act that is going towards not only services for the unhoused, but also to just in general. The city has a transparency portal. It seems to be updated every once in a while, but I'd like to see who's getting the money. There's been complaints. I've heard a lot of complaints about transparency in like the RFP process. That's a complicated process.
Yes.
So it's difficult to say, like difficult to ask for loads of transparency, but I think that's what providers want. And also just in general, just I'm interested to see where this goes, what other plans the city has beyond the American Rescue Plan funding, and yeah, those are the questions I have.
Okay, great. Kavahn Mansouri is investigative reporter for KCUR in Kansas City and the Midwest Newsroom, who's speaking with us today about what is happening with 24/7 shelters for our homeless neighbors here in St. Louis. Kavahn, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Elaine.
Today's episode was produced by Alex Hoyer, with audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr. Our production intern is Avery Rogers. Our executive producer is Alex.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Our podcast proudly supports St. Louis artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, providing more than 41,000 jobs in the production of wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details at choosewood.com.